Hello everyone, today we continue our Imperial Universal Traditional series about the Roman people, the Italic migrations, the Indo-European spirituality infused by that. Recently we talked about both the Dorian migration for Hellas. We discussed in that case that sort of powerful re-injection of Indo-European religious ideals in this last big and sort of fully definitive phase of Indo-European settlement in Southern Europe between the end of the second and the beginning of the first millennium BC. We've looked at the Olympians from the Hellenic side. We have explained, because this is also as part of a broader comparative as much as diachronic analysis and criticism of the way the various Indo-European branches declined such beliefs. This is crucially important, not just in a pure metaphysical sense, because it explains how, also according to the same peoples, of course, there was a primal origin, right, of divine source, of course, and the direct continuity, actually, of divine power in the world, in mankind, but also quite methodologically relevant for anyone who coming especially from a sort of particularly at this point standard way of approaching Indo-Europeistics tends to criticize as essentially unverifiable, unprovable, and or very much hypothetical to a degree. I will not now descend on this topic that I could make an entire video on. As I always say before starting these videos, I think that at this point we also made tens of these, right? And with related topics, because say if we talk about the medieval church, you can't but talk about the same Catholic dimension of Indo-European worldview, which, as always, I like to provoke you with in a truly pre-Christian sense, that I still have people saying, but you said that, how is that? Or things like, you said that polytheism did not exist. And I like to provoke people because at this point, it's not just like I made so many videos on this topic that if you don't search, you cannot have even a serious approach to like when you approach the same channel. But that are veritably self-evident when you study, in fact, history of religion in such diachronic and comparative way. Right, many people studying Indo-Europeistics somehow stop also just to the religious dimension. They do not look at the historical aspects of the same, or the political ones, or can be also, naturally, who studies Indo-European theology, tries to reconstruct it, uses sort of linguistics prepotently, as we also do here unavoidably. But you can, if you don't enter a sort of broader and longer ranged historical analysis, you can't quite understand why these things are interconnected. This is arguably the greatest problem of our civilization in a strictly academic sense, that we hyper-specialize in anything. It's not even the ideologies that stem from that, because if you don't have a more, I don't like the term holistic, I like the term synthesis, as a matter of fact, it's better. In English, you don't even have, apparently, the term synthetic, if not sort of in a last sense, while you have analytical, as a matter of fact. The synthetic means made of, certain material. But you may think, what does have this to do? It has everything to do with that, because if there is a language that also in this case, incidentally, very Indo-European in the foundations, and you properly start departing as a culture from the very etymology of the words that you speak in your own native vocabulary, it's going to be a bit difficult to have a clear worldview to begin with, because your same language is polluted with probably a distortion of the original meaning of the language, the words that you use. Now, aside from this, and of course we will make, I must make this here, we're close to 30,000 subscribers, not much of an announcement, but say to comfort you a little bit. The amount of stuff we can discuss for this topic is inexhaustible. I will not leave enough to cover everything. You know that this is not just about covering this or that religion in one or two videos. This is the entire work behind that. And the entire work behind that aims exactly at affirming this very specific traditional awareness. The fact that this stuff really existed was universally believed, and I would stress universally here, right? It wasn't just a thing like a barrier between, even as we explained before, like the various different declensions of the same original spirituality, right? Those are very important, of course. It's not like they didn't matter, but what matters the most is the fact that it was a unitary origin of this, and especially a shared one also across the world. This is not even just an Indo-European thing. This is where people sort of have issues to understand that the entire understanding that mankind had about the origin of the world, the origin of themselves, was unitary. Like the entire traditional bodies at that point of essentially religious knowledge that we have is explicit about this. It draws a portrait that is entirely coherent with the rest. It's not like you have studied at school, like there are some these strange religions out there and nobody knows what they are, or like some people like to do, no, because Christianity was just another thing that was before, it was just something else. It was paganism, right? If like this is also pretty straightforwardly sort of and as empirically observable and demonstrable, you have actually been indoctrinated like that. Like the people themselves who taught this stuff may have not realized that, but it's not just an incredibly cheap, superficial, elementary, simplified view of the world, but it has a standard of categorization that has absolutely nothing to do with the field of history of religion, even as we understand it today, at least in a higher academic dimension. Admittedly, while I had in my department in common also history of religion, history of Christianity, and they sort of, I even have partially that title in one of my degrees, and I had to study for that reason, very specific part of my curriculum, as far as those subjects were concerned. And I don't have, however, this sort of, I don't work as a specialist in those fields, the awareness that this whole thing was unitary is pretty much explicit, pretty much, especially in all pre-World War II kind of studies. And again, people can make all the political associations that they want with that, but it's not even the point when I'm here, which often gets misunderstood. I literally make videos about, National Socialism. I have people who think that I am supporting National Socialism for some reason. Right? And this is very common as a YouTube experience, that you make some videos and in the very explanation of certain specific topics, people do not see anything, right? It's as if they were completely dewired from what I'm talking about, but maybe they see just the video, they project something on that and immediately assume that it's their own sort of hamster-brained interpretation of the same. So not even just to say I'm critical against National Socialism. It's literally people not having a clue about what I'm talking about. And this is, again, incredibly common, especially on YouTube, but just remember that there is a very heavily sensorial control from the top here, and that people who come here to listen to my videos seriously are not going to be distracted by this kind of sort of instrumentalization of my content. And this is valid also for these, because I'm arguably even far beyond the far right, except the far right doesn't even have the palest idea of what this means, and that's where they should be very scared. In any case, today we talk sort of more friendly terms, of course, about Rome, which is also the enormous object of contention, because the way you see Rome is the way you see the world. The single most contentious topic in the history of mankind is not Christianity, is not, say, other sort of specific political issues. It is how you see Rome, right? If you open Twitter, as I unfortunately have to do just to share a little bit more of my content, you see that people are absolutely looping in some kind of weird, subjectivistic and emotionalistic misinterpretation of Romanity and as a consequence any other historical topic, without even realizing that there is a deeper level of actual interpretation. It's mostly like partisan attitudes from both sides or multiple sides, how you want to see that. We're still those people saying, as I agree, by the way, with the Holy Roman Empire was actually Roman, but without explaining how or why that was the case on a deeply theological basis also in Roman Archaic times. And people say, no, the Byzantine Empire was actually the only Roman one. And even scholarly reviewed individuals were trying to make weird points on Twitter without, even in that case, explaining absolutely anything, but just sort of parroting an adage at that point. And that makes you understand how much also specialists are completely severed from that comprehensive vision of the wall. And I say, from my perspective, that is the one of a modest medievalist and military historian, is something frankly embarrassing, and that I would never subject myself to. In any case, that's the funny part. Of course, the less people understand, or at least I'm here to explain things, but the less, of course, this is understandable, let's put it in this way, to people by their own standards, and the more controversial this all becomes. That's where we start having fun. Because there is actually nothing controversial about anything. Like, it's all very well documented in the Indo-European. The point is, do we want to put this together? That's the actual thing we're doing here. So we talk Rome. I think in October I made a video that received lots of views about the sort of ideological counterposition of the Chthonic, essentially Pelagian principle of the Etruscans, and the Iranian, Indo-European one of the Romans. That alone, people would say, meh, how do we know? Watch that video, as a matter of fact. Because it's literally the primary sources that explicitly say that, by the way. It's not me making things up or being overly interpretative or whatever. So we go back partially to this, because it's definitely not even the first time we talk about Roman religion. Arising from the world of the Italic peoples, a group of Indo-European tribes, including the Latins, Sabines, and Osco-Umbrians, as you know, migrated to the Italian peninsula around the period we're talking about before, essentially the 2nd millennium BC. Again, as far as the Italic migrations, we know really very few. We're just sort of overwhelmingly documenting that from an ethnogenetic, linguistical, cultural, also religious point of view. So as for the other essentially undocumented parts of Europe, we just know it happened. But it's very different from what is a bit the exception, as a matter of fact, because Italy is even well documented compared to the rest of Europe, but the exception is obviously Hellas, right? Because there was a much stronger, let's say, documentable, much more strongly documentable, which doesn't mean even more intense, sort of ethnogenetically intense, but still, Indo-European substratum with the Mycenaean civilization. Again, the video about Dorian migration explains everything. And given that that part of Europe was historically the most advanced, we also have way more traces. For the rest of Europe, largely not much, but Italy comes second. This is also the, as you know, region from which the entirety of Europe was alphabetized, because essentially the Greeks were, in that sense, more literally advanced already, but they stuck to the coastal areas that did not have much of a continental expansion, or just sort of overall even instantiations, so to say, like, for example, the Italic peoples, that were also many, as a matter of fact, as the also later Romano-Italic Confederacy would prove, right? And when we look at sort of the backdrop of this essentially Villanovan Italy that had already, in fact, had Indo-Europeans migrating from ever, because that's also the very interesting aspect of this all, that the more we archaeologically study things, the more we realize that there is actually no broader awareness through such merely materialistic means, as we have unfortunately been deterministically and relativistically taught, like archaeology solves everything. When you analyze, for example, even ethnogenetics, for example, how many people actually moved at different times, like how many war bands, how many single errant charioteers, like in the European retinues, moved across this, I mean, Europe and beyond, as a matter of fact, and how much, like even up to China or the Middle East, etc. It's a radical impact that we start witness even just from the essentially 4000 BC. So there is a substratum, but in these two parts of Europe, the Balkan and the Italian peninsula, there is across the second and the first millennium BC, the largest Indo-European migration to be recorded in the West, that fundamentally settles, again, the Hellenic and the Italic people, respectively. And we will, if you're interested in preparing, for example, a video about the Samnites that are Oscans and sort of straightforwardly Indo-European in that sense. But there is a bit this idea that we would single out peoples like the Etruscans, or even outside of Italy, for example, the Ligurians that were at least in Italy and in Gaul as well, or the Baskets that are say, we don't know what they actually spoke, of who they actually were, but it turns out that still the interland populations followed pretty much the same ethno-linguistic patterns of the broader group, right, of the broader original pools. We explained that also for the Etruscans, aside from the fact that it could have as well been Indo-European, raiding, as it was normally the case also during the Sea Peoples invasions like the Mediterranean. Where they were more like elites that imposed themselves on a Villanovan substratum rather than, an entire people that at some point had come or developed there for some strange reason. And that's also very important because, as we've seen in the video about the Pelasgian ethos and vibe of the Etruscans, it's not like the Etruscans, for example, had a Chthonic, fully fledged Pelasgian religion, like with properly an inversion of, say, the Iranian paradigm. They had properly superior virile deities that, however, ended up under a terrible superstition of the of this hidden gods that would decide even their own fate. And so in an incredibly deterministic and terrible sense, which is very well exemplified by the terrible idea that the Etruscans had of their afterlife, as a matter of fact. And so the point being that these differences are very much political, identitary, spiritual, rather than merely ethnic, or at least in places like Italy. I mean, what the difference would have existed between Latium and Etruria, that were literally next door, virtually known, or at least there may have well been on a provincial basis. Surely the Latins may have easily been, again, more Indo-European in ancestry than the Etruscans. Also, if you look at their social structure, their culture, and so on, but because they were more like individual freemen. The Etruscan society was much more stratified. It was just an elite and serfs, basically. Also the warlike Apenninic tribes being something very different, albeit also less developed than the Etruscans at some point were the dominant civilization. In Italy, we've seen in the Western Mediterranean, as a matter of fact, even above the Magno Greeks and even the Carthaginians at some point. We were seeing it in videos about ancient naval warfare, ancient warships. The Etruscans pioneered at some point naval technology for a long time. All these things. I say them just because there may be people who literally do not know this. This also happens very frequently, that we have to simply give this background because you talk, as we'll see now, about things that go beyond, or at least sort of more in depth than this. However, you discover every once in a while there are some kids, especially like young ones, that literally have never heard any of this. Like this, when I went to school, these things, at least sort of the Indo-European cat per se, that wasn't there. But let's say the fundamentals, right, of Europe, their identities, how we know, also later through high school and so on, like the things were notorious. You discover that kids are literally not told this stuff anymore in schools, right? So if Schwerpunkt can minimally help, well, I'm glad, of course. Now, in particular, today we talk about Rome. So when you look at the Latins, they established their early settlements like Alba Longa. That literally means white height, right? Means white and long. And that becomes with the temple of Jupiter Latiaris, as a matter of fact, the most important spiritual center of the Latins, the Olympus as well. Like the remains of Alba Longa, I don't know if you have ever visited them. They're close to Rome, and there's a beautiful sort of ancient and medieval historical Roman interland that really deserves a lot. And Alba Longa was, in this sense, we've explained it also in other videos, incarnating all this Olympian magnificence of the Indo-European sort of vibe of the Latin peoples that were constituting, as you know, as a league. They were feeling spiritually tied by the reverence to this specific sanctuary. And that would naturally influence the cultural and linguistic foundations of, say, Rome, because Alba Longa at some point ruled over Rome. This is also foundational in the Romulan legend, what sort of the story is. This is obvious. We will talk more about Archaic Rome. I made something about the Age of Kings, etc., but it's also really notorious. For this reason, Rome was, since her very origin, they also made video on as far as the Livyan interpretation, Livyan version of the same is concerned, which is deeply mythological and obviously so, but objectively shocking in its revelatory meaning, in her foundation so deeply bound to the spiritual ancestry of such Indo-European foundation that much really about also the rest of the Roman sagas is fully explained into fact that original and unitary fashion. However, this is extremely important. We discussed it at some point also in the video about the Etruscans. There is something incredibly characteristic about the rise of Rome that overlaps actually with very specific theological principles that we explained in that video about Indo-European theology regarding the sacred waters, all right? Revolving around the older Mediterranean and Near Eastern cultural background, or at least this broader Pelasgian one, for example, the same Etruscan influences that we've seen, again, even if they had an actual virile patriarchal foundation, etc., they had been heavily informed by that Mediterranean vibe. And from, in fact, the broader Villanovan culture of 900, 700 BC in central Italy, that overlaps in here also the chronologies are relatively anecdotal, but of course the Indo-Europeans coming to central Italy, by the way, we don't know what the Latins were actually called at the origin, because Latin is an adjective derived from Latium that was already called like that, which means wide, right? So at least it is an Indo-European term, but to describe a place, not the actual name of the Indo-European tribes that settled there, unfortunately enough. And this is normal considering, again, the relative mists of history when the Indo-Europeans settled. As well as broader borrowings from Phoenician, Hellenic, and Anatolian traditions via trade and colonization, even in early Roman adoption of deities like Cybele and practices like the Auguries. Now, we'll talk about these things better in another video. What matters here is that in the European theology, as we've seen, the idea of divine resurgence in all the myths is tied to the reaching of a lowest point, which is incidentally the darkest of the abyss, of the waters, right? The myth of the saved from the waters, from Romulus to Moses to Merovech. It's a great trope that shows also how truly universal this concept was. And there is something deeper to that is to say, the dissolution of the shadows, or the chthonic, the Pelasgian element, is not a process of annihilation, but it's a process of transfiguration, meaning that the world, as we know it, is essentially an hypostasis of the heavenly nature, and the divine accomplishment of man as a mortal in becoming divine is truly transfiguring not just himself, but as a trail, the entire world. Of course, if you are God in its plenitude, this should literally eliminate the lower nature, and so transcend it, totally transfigure it into the divine. And in this notion, the idea is that the very darkest elements of the world that are still animated anyhow, because they are just basically an instantiation of the greatest sin, but not of complete death, because even water, even earth, as we've seen, also the pre-Indo-European idea of ge matter, of the civilization of the matter, and so on, is obviously and necessarily, also in a broader metaphysical sense, I mean, man and woman, obviously enough, entwined, right? And of course, there is a different role where the Father, right, ingravitates the matter, in this sense, creates the Son truly of God, that through divine grace and this power can return to the Father in the plenitude of the Trinity, which is entirely documentable in the Indo-European tradition, not just because some people think Dumezil was just reasoning in terms of like applying it to everything. The entire body of Indo-European theology and of existence is expressed by the Trinity, or better, the Trinity expresses that at the same time. So what also you find in Christianity, right, is literally coming straight from this universal concept. It's not a just Christian invention. It was technically conceived also within the same Old Testament, and therefore also any other culture who came after this period of sort of traditional antiquity, not acknowledging the role of the Trinity, regardless of the reasons, such as the absolutization of God, however, still misses completely the idea of the lower nature and the tripartite functionality of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, which is containing the entire mechanism that essentially the entirety of what we call tradition is substantiated by. That is to say, the explanation of the actual mechanism of how you can revert to divinity, right? So if you don't acknowledge that, it's like just basically a disintegration of Catholic tradition. It's like saying, I don't know, the Muslims didn't have it for some reason. No, the Muslims didn't have it because they didn't even know what Catholic theology was meant to be from a Bedouin tribal background, all right? It's just like Protestantism. I mean, if you reject the works as effectively and positively instrumental to helping achieving salvation, this is not Christianity. I don't know how to stress that. It's not just, obviously, it's not Catholicism, but it's not Catholicism in the sense that Catholicism predated Christianity as far as this very specific meaning is entailed. And of course, something that encompasses the entire work, which is what Catholicism really is about. So the point of all this, why do we talk about it? Because Rome, in her growth, manifests this twofold nature. From one side, a radically virile Uranian Indo-European worldview, especially in the elites, in the sacred kings of Rome that the older sagas are all about, and later also the senatores, as definitely a product of the world, the generation in general, in various steps, but still with standards that were recognized even by Pyrrhus, for example, and his ambassador Cunius as in the Roman Senate as a consensus of kings, not of sort of nobodies, as a matter of fact, kings intended in the sacral sense, which is exactly what the senatorial institution, even etymologically speaking, has to do with. If you don't understand what, in that sense, old, in terms of senex, means, there was someone who was asking this, like saying, but, I thought it was do you know, in that sense, what being old means? Do you know what it means to be mortal, right? So let's be very precise when you talk about Indo-European theology, because it's not really somebody's opinion. From the other, as we also very well know, through Roman history, there is the plebeian, the chthonic, the human, which means literally humus, dirt, substratum, that one could, of course, ideally separate on a ethnic basis, thinking that everybody from the higher estates was just straightforwardly Indo-European. That's not actually how this works also among men. Like, you can have sort of various degrees of mixing and transfiguration, even of the lower elements, which actually Rome will be the greatest mistress of, if you think about what, again, the Romano, the peoples that Rome had conquered could do in taking over the world from Italy under her guidance and one of her, incredible establishment. But in this sense, substantiating very powerful chthonic forces in this Roman situation. And the interesting aspect is that these chthonic forces are not merely passive or there. They are actively antagonistic to the Uranian and virile principle. In other words, the struggles between patricians and plebeians that I also explained in that video about the Roman conquest of Italy, because at some point the Romans take off. Right? There is a very specific moment, very much connected with the sagas of Furius Camillus. Dumezil wrote something beautiful about this, but you also must master the most updated military historical acknowledgments of what Rome achieved at that point in history. The point being that essentially, just like the Great Mother is tamed and possessed and transfigured as the angel, as Mary, as the symbol of the angelic woman, not the fury, the Iranian, this chthonic force. So, right, the greater power of civilization actually derives from the success of in harnessing such power. In other words, also what we see, for example, in our culture, this muscular struggle between different worldviews and political directions, etc., is actually the symptom, yes, of a crisis, because it can potentially destroy civilization, but actually can manifest only in the very center of actual power. We're talking about this also in the recent Q&A video. So when you look at Rome and the vastity of this Pelasgian substratum, at least not much in a quantitative sense, also you could think also from a genetic point of view, but especially from a spiritual one, because we know that specific Italic peoples that had migrated from Central Europe by the time, for example, of the Roman conquest were characterized as, for example, influenced by a lunar vibe. For example, the Sabines, right? The same most ancient Roman calendar was not solar, it was lunar. So there is in Romanity all this severe stratification, for example, of feminine elements that were, however, transfigured. Think about, for example, the Vestal virgins. Like among the Vedas, this was not a function, a priesthood that could be entrusted to the women. But in that sense, Rome was so overly confident in her virile dominance that the Vestal virgins could be obviously virgins, and obviously in that sense representing the same transfigured angelic woman, hold the sacred fire of the world. I made multiple videos about Vesta, and we'll come back on that as well, because it's definitely a bit like one of the many cornerstones without which Rome could have not really existed, but that it was Rome to fully create, right? Because as we've seen also in other videos, when you think about it, it's plenty of publications explaining how, for example, Rome developed and managed to conquer the world and so on, but none of them actually explains the reason why that happened. And it is, at least in conventional historiographical terms, and in this sense moral scientific ones, still a contentious topic, because, you know, this is valid for any other culture. Like, how do you explain it? Right? We're habituated to think about socio-economical factors, essentially materialistic determinism. But when you really look at the history of people, so there isn't really a single or even a sum of motivations that alone, based on that, can explain why one would rise in that fashion. Right? So there is evidently something moral, spiritual, religious that Rome, in the entire plethora of Indo-European peoples, essentially mastered, reaching the very top of world domination. And as it was deeply understood still in medieval times with the Holy Roman Empire, had managed to essentially make Rome divine, right? And therefore necessarily having a Roman identity in any one would seize the empire, right? In other words, the Ottonians, right, would be metaphysically self-identifying as Romans, which was also a great problem at the time. Ask Widukind of Corvey, was not really happy with this, but of course at those higher levels also of military in this sense, imperial tradition that lived a bit, as you know, aside and especially, not assigned, but in parallel, and especially not well documented by the clergy that at the time was the only one writing, and in a sense was not initiated to those circles, military circles, even though they did understand a lot of that themselves, would perennially reactivate on the basis of this older tradition. And we know that if you study Meister Eckhart, he literally tells you like that there was a master who taught them that stuff, right? It's not a myth. It's not like because we can't clearly document it, like it isn't evident that it was there, right? This is also often, unfortunately, the same with Indo-Europeistics. But this term could mean something else. So who told you that that's actually the actual explanation? Well, because the more you study that, the more you realize how organically coherent, without even a single exception, and actually by totalizing meaning, this, for example, language is our very language, the very words that we speak. That's why I started recently that very series explaining phoneme by phoneme what Indo-European theology was about, not what Indo-European language was about, but chiefly the religious meaning attributed probably to this sacred utterance, echoing the divine word, the logos, the verbum. If you wonder why we also like that, hear of that in Christianity, that actually entail. And again, we'll make another video in which we'll explain the tectonic substratum over which the Indo-European tradition of Rome grafted itself in. What is truly remarkable, right, is how Rome broke away from it, and decisively so, because throughout the entire empire, and so you can argue until the 19th century, and echoing in sort of institutions all around the world today, Roman imperial symbolism being present all across the globe as a consequence by institutional imitation, Rome remained always in charge with that ideology. It never said, well, but our actual belief is to be substituted. I mean, even Christianity, we were talking about that, it is explicitly, straightforwardly backing Romanity, very differently from even how I was listening today, something horrifying. But I don't want to make any names because also people pass away, sort of, especially in that way, that's not really a good thing. But I mean, the notion that Christians were essentially just persecuted uninterruptedly, like so from 33 AD to the Edict of Thessalonica, or at least to the Edict of Milan, is something absolutely ridiculous. Christians normally lived within the empire without incident, right? The persecutions were carried out only in specific, sort of overall in these centuries, very sort of small amount of years, and at the discretion, by the way, of provincial governors, even when by imperial edict. That is to say, we do not have evidence of, say, I don't know, tens of thousands of Christians ever being slaughtered in an instance because they were persecuted by the terrible Rome that it had nothing to do with. I say this because, as we've seen also in the recent Q&A, you have kids today who think that Christianity was some sort of subversive force that simply wanted to destroy the empire. If you read, because people don't do this, if you read Christian apologists of those very centuries that were also very well socially integrated in the empire already, which was something that happened very quickly, by the way, even among the elites. And again, we made tons of videos on this, and it's all very notorious and documented, and I can absolutely assure you, absolutely recognized by historiography. It's not an interpretation, an option. The most updated historiography knows this as clear as it gets. Christians fully, openly backed the empire. They were Roman themselves. Like, they understood, of course, that in their view, the empire had failed to recognize the divinity of Christ. But aside from, being within the universal empire, they also fully participated to the Roman cult, such as in the army. It was full of Christians in the army. We know pretty well already from the second century AD. Even in the Gospels, there is an actual example, centurion recognizing Christ. But in general, think about the miracle of the rain during the Marcomannic Wars. This is notorious. And what sort of is more perplexing in all of this is that if, especially as an undereducated person, you start from the presumption that you know anything about this topic without even having read anything, and especially without having read anything about not Christian sacred text, but literally, again, straightforward lay, public, even sometimes liberal written Christian historiography that uses primary sources telling you, look, these people were literally there. Like, because I say liberal because some, of course, like some of them, first of all, they're normally Christian if they study this thing, but not only. Some of them just do it because they want to reapproach their spirituality. But at this point, there isn't simply the Marxist professor. At least you have that as lesser people in places like the United States, very Americanized European countries. So we're talking about people from the 1968 generation that were actually born, raised Catholic, were still Catholic even when they were making leftistic things in their youth. And that as still cultural people today, you can work or talk with them. In that literally offer a positive interpretation of Christianity to the point of not even sometimes fully recognizing this in terms of, look, that these guys, because that's the mistake they also do, they try themselves to oppose Christianity to what existed before, without having studied what existed before. So the same Christianity was saying, embracing fully that Catholic dimension, right, against all the, for example, Gnostic heresies that were totally rejected by the Indo-European incarnation doctrine, truly the Catholic understanding of how the entire world was to be redeemed. So all the nonsense of the Cathars, that is basically the same communistic heresy rebooting throughout all history in sort of different terms depending on the sort of historical context, but with the same identical theological foundation, including the one that we see today. For example, transgenderism as an attitude towards this scission, this separation between the body and the soul, and all this kind of BS. It's the same thing. It's psychiatrically, anthropologically, religiously, sociologically explainable. We know very well why these people are defective, and they behave like that. Right? It's a mental illness. I'm not even talking just about transgenderism as, those who are trans. I'm talking properly whoever believes in this. It's probably a universal tendency, right, in the mind that is perfectly described in all traditional mythology as well, right? And if you take the time, that's why at the beginning I was saying you must really study history. There is not a way to be a traditional person and not having a higher education. It doesn't matter how you get it. Like, you don't have to get a PhD or whatever, but you have to at least go through something that is similar, right? Unless you get the full meaning straight. But I personally don't know many people who know this stuff. And that defines a bit the concept that you can't simply approach everything through merely, okay, I will read, I don't know, this myth or the Bible by themselves because I can't understand it. There was an actual catechesis also in Christianity. It was an actual initiation also before Christianity. And the thing actually continues, right? The same Christianity is a mysteric cult. There is nothing, in fact, even technically mysterious in the way we intend mysteric cult because it's spooky and edgy or whatever. It's literally how the entire traditional approach is about. And if you miss that, it's a bit difficult that you're going to understand anything about ancient spirituality or tradition in general. Now, Rome broke, as we've seen, decisively from this Pelasgian tonic substratum, bringing forth a new influence that resists being reduced to those antecedent forms. Antecedent, we refer to what the Indo-Europeans found in Italy in the various waves they came there, and the same Romans conquering, again, neighbors like the Sabines. The Sabines occupied territories that are today even properly in the historical center of Rome as a different people from the Romans. So for telling you how close they were. And obviously in that you can see, if you know, like the original alliance of Romulus with the Sabines and the etymologies, Titus Statius, we will talk about those. They are all, by the way, the same in term. Etruscans, Romans, and Sabines were the Indo-European trinity, but never mind. We will talk about this better because it really deserves in another video. And as such, they found a world next door that was ensnared instead by the Pelagian worldview and spiritual tendency. Now, the chthonic dimension remains. As we said, Rome could have not expanded, had not stood on it, had not reinvigorated it and transformed it in the process. This new Roman influence could not only assert and expand itself through an unremitting contest waged both inside the city and against foes beyond its walls. Think about it. They would have been outnumbered, right? This is all based on the fact that in theory, just like Romulus, you could revert God, divinely transfigure in a blaze, in a cloud, going back to Jupiter, which is deeply meaningful. But in more historical terms, in political, social, and military ones, because the history of Rome in that sense is always military, by way of continual reactions, accommodations, and deep transformations that would essentially secure a senatorial establishment in an hegemonic position to eventually accept the co-optation of the plebeian element and transfiguring it into free Roman citizenry, as it will become later, in the true original, if I can, Indo-European view of that, right? Not an, say, egalitarianization of the less, but an egalitarianization to the top, right? The Romans as God's chosen people, the one that had the unrelentingly pursued mission of conquering the world. There are so many steps in Roman history in which you can immediately see this, right? The fact that the Romans would be beaten sometimes in some of the most humiliating ways, so the ones that had literally to terrify them, because humus means dirt, and to terrify in Latin stands for to make earth, right? Think about the Battle of the Caudine Forks or the same bloodbath of Cannae. Those were moments in which the Romans should have understood that they were defeated, and instead they simply realized that they weren't. It is a purely spiritual acknowledgement, and not only that, but they essentially struck back and they conquered everything and everyone. Now, in Rome, the archetype of a sovereign conquering manliness takes concrete form. Virility, this roboris. This is the central vision of Romanity. We explained how the virtus, right, represents this. How, for example, few people know that also within the same Latin, the original meaning of virtus, so the supreme virtue that conglomerated all the other ones in a hierarchical sense, is conceptually and partly even linguistically tied to the same concept of Germanic furor that Romans attributed to the northern European tribes. Essentially, the etymologies are different, the semantics is different, but I made a video, I can't tell you, it was one of the earliest ones I've ever made on this topic. It's I titled it in a way that today I wouldn't title because it's actually correct, but it could be more centered. That is, well, there is the virtus in the Roman Celtic Germanic religion, from the age, the age of order from Caesar, Tacitus, and Vegetius. That is one way. But the one I was talking about is virtus audacia. In fact, I associated audacia with virtus as well. Wut, vots, oder, furor, dasacht, theas, and ferg. The Indo-European sacred fury, which is that sort of sacrificial and self-sacrificial dimension in holy combat that is necessary and that we discuss also in other videos about that very thing in the broader Indo-European tradition. So you understand how much we have done so far for you to go check those videos out and understand what we're concretely talking about, so that I don't have to say more things that I'm already doing now. Now, this archetype of sovereign conquering manliness expresses itself in Rome preeminently in the idea of an establishment, at least historically, the way Romanity went by and succeeded, by the way, in the world domination was statal, right? Today, people have naturally, at least especially conservative people in the Anglo-American world, and a negative idea of state. But of course, the concept of state that a Roman would have understood at the time was importantly different from the one we have today. Not much in a strictly linguistical sense, or at least in the way it was used, which is also a thing, but probably in the metaphysical implications. Right? Today you see the state as some sort of thing of a mass of institutions, of bureaucrats, of something that, especially also in the lesser peoples, superstitious paranoia is obviously always the evil ruling over the poor, oppressed martyrs. That's agnostic heresy, as a matter of fact. If you're Indo-European, you take over everything. If you can't, it's because you're a lesser person. That's the most straightforward traditional interpretation. And actually, in fact, also in Christianity, but this was inherited from Romanity in the Latin Germanic West, there is a very positive sense of the establishment of government, of the monarchy as was conceived. Rome went through different stages, but if you, for example, compare this to the Islamic world has a paranoid distrust towards any earthly authority to begin with, which is absolutely also in that sense antithetical to tradition, because whoever owns power owns that for a reason, right? It's not like they can misuse that, but the question is, where are you? Like, in all this, like, if you are better, why don't you have power, right? And you still have people like Jordan Peterson who gnostically separate an idea of divine power from an idea of earthly power, which is completely nonsensical, because that's the actual meeting ground. What do you think the oligos is? It's the Imperium itself. Whereas if you wage that power, doesn't matter how you wage it, in a sense, because it depends, of course, on who you're ruling. There are ship people, like, I don't know, in the Soviet Union, in communism in general, that are completely worthless, and so, even one person can rule over millions of them. That does not mean that there is a stronger state. Actually, those states are weaker, right, because they rule over lesser people. Instead, the West has maintained by far the most functional mean of actually having greater level of liberty, which, interestingly enough, is different in its Latin root from the concept of freedom, because in the Germanic sense of freedom, you have mostly like a dominion within which you can operate, and so that is entailed in the etymology. The libertas in Latin is something much more interestingly connected with a sense of hierarchy, with the idea that there is a gradual liberation, which is never the full divinization, because a full deus is completely free, does not need even somebody else sort of still controlling him partially. As you know, the Romans took over the world by manumission. They truly were a regime of masters who essentially granted liberty through the munus, through the merit/duty of those who would fight and die in the Roman legions for this massively aristocratic nobiliar establishment that could control these large swathes of people as clients, and that eventually could become free, completely free, with evolving concepts of citizenship up to essentially the decline. So we're talking basically at the peak during the Augustan era, where truly the Romano-Italic people conquered and controlled the entire world just by straightforward military colonization, even altering the ethno-linguistic pattern, essentially of most of the West, even parts of Central Europe. And so in that sense, you have a very concrete dimension of how heavily steeped in the sense of Auctoritas, the prestige and advisory influence of the leader Romanity was. This is incredibly central because, again, you do not find this expression. The idea of the state, at least of what we intend today as a state, as an establishment, and think about the res publica, this was all metaphysically intended. Again, the Imperium manifests, just like through Augustus, a primus inter pares that basically just commands others. It's a bit the same concept of the war band. It's what the same Romans were writing about the Germanic leaders of the comitatus. These people just are followed in virtue of, in fact, of their own virtus, of their own manhood, of their own virility. And in time of peace, everybody reconstitutes itself in this more liberal, egalitarian, permissive fashion, as long as these people are worthy, right? In tradition, there is no such thing like people must be let free, so they are capable of being free. If you're a lesser person, you cannot, by definition, be free. You can have freedom, but having your entire state collapse and everybody die, right? Because you must have any worth, right? Regardless of what you've been told, how we've been indoctrinated for generations, being a human and having any value are two completely and radically and totally separated things, right? And the only fact that you're human, so means dirty in Latin, is a problem, right? You need a master, somebody who's superior to you to actually liberate you and to rise up, right? And this, of course, the master can fail and destroy you. This is what you see in oppressive regimes of inferior cultures, as a matter of fact, all across the world. And so when you complain about the West that has enormous problems, and nobody is here to deny it, and I'm not referring here to anybody who asked recently about this, because this is just valid for everybody, it's an old rant of mine, just trying to look around the world and tell me what is the actual ratio there, which other peoples can master their own imperium outside the West, and how, in terms of individual quality and worth of actual people, that's something extremely, extremely different and vast. But this is, again, enormously important, because the viciously multicultural, liberal, whatever interpretation of Romanity that we've been fed, so basically a sort of a stagnatingly promiscuous, corrupted, perturbed system that was there for no reason whatsoever, that has reason that, as we explained before, has been canceled for any historical book explanation, is completely, radically, and absolutely annihilated by the total foundation of the purest meaning of Romanity. That is to say, a massive hierarchy where a divinely chosen people lorded over, in a feudal sense, over the rest of the cosmos, which is something, by the way, that was pretty much akin to the essentially the late Bronze Age, sort of early Iron Age way of ruling of sort of people in Europe. I made a video that is titled Feudal Roman Warfare, because regardless of what people conceptualize this, there was actually and properly a moment of clanic, feudal, oligarchic Rome that was much more similar, say, to a medieval state than, in fact, the idea of the republic, or even worse, of the democracy that we kind of have. Those are purely conventional terms, do not mean anything. The Romans did not define themselves like that, because res publica is not our own meaning of republic, right? That we matured mostly from the Enlightenment. And in the negative sense of the Enlightenment, there is also a positive part of the Enlightenment, but unfortunately, what in mass society, of course, the majority of lesser people absorbed is the corruption and the immoral distortion of the same. So, the state, the authority of the leader, and the Imperium. The Imperium is obviously the single most fundamentally important tract of Romanity. All right, the spirit that the Holy Ghost, literally, that permeates the entire Roman state, the authority of the leaders, is divine grace, right? Earned through works by means of virtue itself, and the quite straightforward kind of ritual relation that exists between God and man. I made some videos about the latter topic also for the rest of the Indo-European peoples, this comparative approach. But in Rome, the Imperium is fundamental, because we still call different polities in history through the Latin term empire, right? The Imperium is, say, if we were to answer this in the later legalistic sense, is the supreme executive power granting military command and jurisdiction. In practice was pure power, all right? And the sole source of power in tradition is God, which means that, as we explained, the Auctoritas is, which is truly connected with a sense of authoriality, if you want, means that he who exercises this power does not do it in a merely from a merely conferative sense. I don't know if this word exists in Latin, in English, but confederate in Latin means properly to confer. In fact, in English exists. It's just the adjectivization here that I use that doesn't sort of sound very right. But it is the fact that, yes, as the same Augustus wrote, derives from the auspices of the supreme priestly power that also, in fact, military commanders have, because remember that these are faculties that initially were all one in the king, that was also sacred ruler. Then eventually this is split in the so-called Republican period among the various Roman magistracies and routinely shared by this body of senators that, in this sense, was acting as the original one and had therefore different tasks, routinely, sort of collegially and circularly passed and so on. But this is the product of, so terrible term, let's say, the instantiation of the divine power wielded by the same ruler. That is to say, this ruler doesn't merely receive power and then uses it like a credit. He can do whatever he wants. He can exercise power only if he's in that moment acting accordingly to it, right? So he becomes to that degree divine and therefore fully exercising that will, transferring from the higher nature, that divine power, through the Imperium. Thus, it's the same thing, the Holy Ghost, divine grace, on earth to rule it and to regenerate it and redeem it, transfigure it, and bring back to the golden age. I recently, as you know, made a video about the Roman concept of heaven, which is very well, in that sense, described in Virgil's fourth eclogue, but we know really a lot from Roman religion that, as we'll see now, is also notoriously said about, but we know too few about the Roman Archaic religion, their suppositions. It all matches with all what we know about Indo-European texts, and they would have actually known, in fact, still by the time they wrote more about it, and that we'd say allegedly, but they didn't understand it anymore because it's not really, right? This is something also leading way further into the Byzantine Sebastocratic view. It lived all along. It's not like by the time of Livy they did not understand it. Admittedly, they had already some more modern secular approach to it, but the deeper meaning in the sagas and whichever sources they used that unfortunately we're not aware of were pretty clear about this, and we can easily see it. You can imagine them, right? The Imperium is the only thing that actually matters, right? Together with Romanity, which will end up to overlap in a truly imperial Catholic sense, as we explained. The Imperium had a great deal of symbology. For example, the Fasces carried by the lictores, that, for example, are still present on the US Senate iconography, for that matter, and pretty much all over the world. The fact that it became the symbol of fascism is obviously not random, because fascism was inspiring itself through the literal fasces, but literally it's such a universal meaning that, and it represents also, by the way, the war axe culture of the Indo-Europeans, the civilization of the North, the entire influxes that was received, and of course, in the case of the fasces, the degree of unity that the various sticks, that the bundle properly that holds the axe, right? So this is overwhelmingly important. It's literally, as you know, different magistrates were followed by the lictores that thus manifested all this battle axe capacity, literally going across the world, allowing this imperial magistracies, that once provided properly with the Imperium, to operate, to transfigure the world according to the Roman dictates. Now, the Roman state, understood in the way we do, and again, there isn't much of a difference also from conceptually from the other idea of the Indo-European establishment. We partially talked about this also for the Germans, say at the time of the Franks, of the Merovingians, of the Carolingian Empire. How was properly this sense of power created? And the original Roman state was very similar. was based on the same foundation. We're just looking at different times and therefore different instantiations. It sort of rises and falls, but we're looking at the same identical concept of power. Regime set under the protection of same Olympian deities that we have just recently described in the particularly Hellenic vision, in fact, of the reaffirmed after the Dorian migration. There's a very symbolism, and also there, as we've seen, an important mix between, in this eternal struggle, by the way, between the Olympian deities themselves and the Pelasgian ones, that in Greece was arguably even more important than in Rome, because Rome at some point has this overarching, absolute, all-conquering kind of mentality that completely handles the Pelasgian element. It was sort of constantly fighting with that, but affirming itself constantly on it, right? In the Hellenic world, there was a much more prepotent civilization of the mother to keep under, like Python, that had to be routinely killed by Apollo ritually in the same sanctuary of Delphi, in order not to have the envelope of the world to collapse entirely. For the Romans, the center of the world was the oak in front of the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. Naturally, from Alba Longa, that remained an important Jovian sanctuary, of course, also after the Romans took over the rest of the Latins and so on, it shifted to Rome herself. Right, we know, as we've seen also in the video about Montjoie, Saint-Denis, that the entire Western Europe, and likely practically any other part of it, was dotted, but we know in post-Roman times, by sanctuaries that were all known as the Mounts of Jupiter. And this is also part of the consequences of the Roman conquest, creating an incredibly thick sense of European identity through such vision. So the Olympian deities, again, when I say polytheism, as I explained to you, polytheism doesn't mean anything, right? All these peoples believed that there was only one god, one source of power, and deities were just an hypothesis of the same, right? That served some mythological explicative functionality, that had, again, this traditionally ritual initiatory function, but they weren't in this sense some random gods that existed just like because we have to oppose the concept of single god, because that's what we think Christianity about. Christianity literally has the same Trinity, all right? It has the saints. It's the same identical thing to pre-Catholic Christianity and Roman religion and all these ones. So there wasn't such a thing like a belief at any time in history between many gods and a single god. This is complete BS. It's not documented by any religious historical dimension. These are all forces that act just like, I don't know, in Judeo-Christian tradition you see angels and also explicit deities. I mean, also in the Bible there are explicit, what we would call polytheistic sort of rites and sacrifices. This has absolutely nothing to do with an opposition or a strange approach to monotheism. There is only one God for all these peoples. There is no other known understanding of this. The only people would have at most sort of been more dependent on single, and in this sense, different deities were lesser people in octonic dimension, because just they looked at the dirt and maybe they had that sanctuary over there, they didn't move from anywhere. But whoever had the control over the world, there was only one God. And I say this because we've seen in the video recently about the Olympian deities with the various, again, figures, the various forces that in Hellenic mythology represented that power. So Zeus as Deus Pater is obviously God. And then you have this interesting role of Apollo, Athena. We've seen also the incredibly important transfigured lunar meaning of Artemis. It's not like the Romans will not have their equivalents, in part because they were part of the Indo-European sort of pantheon, if we can so call, from the origins, but in particular because they later took over Greece, and so they a bit sort of Hellenized in at least literary mythological references, but without ever giving away their own previous realization. You know that there are three Capitoline triads, right? The first is Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus. That is also a very beautiful expression, in fact, of the Trinity. Then it's Jupiter, Minerva, and Juno. The latter they represent two different things, all right? Two different interpretations, two different political messages. What mattered for the Romans, in any case, primarily was the remote and regal Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the title which is, I think, that doesn't really leave much to be in need of explanation. The capital in Jupiter, chief god and father of the Roman pantheon, housed in the Grand Temple of Jupiter in Capitol Hill, dedicated traditionally 509 BC. Actually, it's more recent. If you look at the foundations of Rome, they are enormous. It's something incredible. This was, of course, there was something before that particular building, and so in the same Jovian symbology, but it makes you understand also how radically important by the 4th century when it was actually built, what kind of meaning it had for the Romans. As a symbol, fact of Rome's civic and divine sovereignty. In this sense, a god that possessed no genealogy, no offspring, no myths rooted in nature, because it represents the full plenitude of the divine. In other words, it's as if the Romans, this is important because, of course, the Romans would have had surely an idea of Jupiter being the father and having a genealogy, but differently from the Greeks, that, as we've seen, were a bit more modern and secular, and also transformed their mythology in some deeper anthropological representation. There is a big deal of stories, right? With Rome, there is the sort of virile austerity of Uranian plenitude. Essentially, Jupiter Optimus Maximus represents the full being, the full divine nature, right? The eternal one, the perennial one, as opposed to the human one that is eternally degenerating into something else. This obviously is due to the fact that the Romans were, by the time they also took off for world domination, were particularly still primitive, and they didn't care much to write, to sort of contemplate this ideas in a sort of abstract or hypothetical sense. They literally went out there conquering other people. They had much more important things to do. And in this sense, if you look at Roman mentality versus Hellenic mentality, already by that point, there was an abyss in between. All right. And also, religiously speaking, there wasn't, other than that Indo-European background, a great deal of deific kind of alignment more than much. It was a completely different mindset that we can beautifully grasp when we read, I don't know, Caesar or Cicero or Tacitus. Those are people that still reason in knightly terms, in incredibly arcane fashion compared to, say, you look at the contemporary Hellenic historiography that were also at that point educated themselves in, right? They were partly also adapting to in the moment in which we're writing, but how they actually thought and explained things. There is, in that video about Pharsalus, something said by Caesar regarding probably the role of the legionary, anthropologically speaking, is shocking, and you can understand only through the lens of Roman spirituality. There was also, from the Roman side, a initiatory mystery about this. It's what we're just saying, that the Roman establishment was very jealous and proud of its own arcane mystery of sacral kingship, right? And especially if we look at later times, we also find probably the Romans talking about this, but in its primal phase, Rome was indissolubly tied to this, right? It is something that was inherited from kings to senators, and that was used to launch the Roman people at the conquest of the world. The adytum was the space reserved in an ancient temple where the laymen were forbidden. And so this was probably the place where the initia regis, so probably the ritual initiations of the king were performed. You understand how enshrined properly in this higher perennial dimension of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on Capitoline he really was. Rome was always an oligarchy, eventually transforming in a monarchy. So there was an important divide between the senators, the Auctoritas that they wielded, and before that also probably the kings and the people, the rest of the estates, right? That in part were also influenced by other people. For example, the Third Estate in Rome was historically a product of Etruscan crafts and commerce, etc. So it was something different from the sacred caste of the rulers that were also priests at some point, and that in fact will not separate that function until Christianity. Remember in that sense that Christianity is born truly through the separation of state and church. And still people today say, but under Christianity there's no separation of state and church. I don't know how asinine people can be, but this is exactly the reason why I also make this video, is because literally the ABC of our Western civilization completely subject to subjective whims, sort of fantasy interpretation of sort of very explicitly notorious history. Marcus Terentius Varro, the famous Roman polymath living between 116 and 27 BC, renowned for his encyclopedic works on antiquities, language, and religion, proclaimed the adutum et initia regis wholly inaccessible to the common man. Right? If you read Varro 7-8, which is used, by the way, by the author to make a very interesting philosophical point. That is to say, because the phrase translated is, so this is a list of aspect, philosophical aspect, and adutum et initia regis quasi non perveniam ad scentiam at opinionem occupabor quod etiam in salute nostra non nunquam facit cum aegrotamus medicus. So it means literally the adutum and the origins of the king, the initiation of the king, to which if I do not arrive at knowledge, at least I shall hunt for an opinion, just as even in our health the doctor sometimes does when we are ill. And this is just thrown in like that, and it basically reflects Roman pragmatism, that is to say, better working hypothesis than none at all. And this is actually referred to the actual religion, because here it's understood in that at the level of Auctoritas, literally the adutum et initia regis, to say there must be something that we can arrive to, like it says in the phrase, much like medicine's empirical methods. If you it's better for a doctor to opt for a probable remedy than to waiting for absolute certainty. And this is a very deeply important concept of Fides we will understand better now. That is to say, acknowledging that there can't be any achievement without essentially a leap of faith, right? A step into the darkness. Because it's only at that point, just like through this initiatory rites, that you can come to an understanding, and not simply, and so of the divine, and not simply sort of fantasizing about that, which actually is incredibly descriptive of our today's time, right? Now, the Imperium, taken first of all in its original sense, neither territorial nor hegemonic, was a mysterious and terrifying power of command. This is how the Romans saw this power, as frighteningly devastating. It's divine wrath. It's the same power of thunder, of Jupiter Pluvius, right? A force belonging, in this sense, not solely to magistrates either, in whom it kept its untouchable quality, no matter how irregular or illegitimate the paths by which they attained office. And we have also seen this in the phoneme AG in the European languages, to say the way the Imperium manifests in the world is not immediately, say, straightforward or linear. The better it is exercised, the more it should be, and that's why, for example, I don't know, there is a word redemption in Transfiguration in the age of Augustus, because it all comes from a more straightforward source of unprecedented power. But this is still the fallen world, and so if you want the golden age to happen, you have to continue exercising this imperium until the entire world becomes one with God. Now, likewise, the imperium belongs, in this sense, to every patrician, to every Roman pater familias, because the Roman people as a whole owns this imperium. There is an incredibly strong sense of the common ancestry, of a especially nobiliar connection with the heavenly firmament, because the difference between patricians and plebeians, I made an entire video about this, is that essentially patricians had ancestors who had re-achieved heaven, whereas plebeians were promiscuous, were understood not having ever had anyone elevating themselves from that, and so their totemic clans had no connection with the celestial dimension. That was the one instead to guide the world. But you see, eventually plebeians also accessed to imperial magistracies, and this happened after the 4th century when the Romans decided to start co-opting also these elements, and so to magnanimously, which is another beautiful Indo-European term from Latin, probably having a great soul that could encompass even the sins of these people and helping, however, transfiguring themselves. Because you cannot really do it without your own will, but the patricians in this sense provided with the preconditions for this mechanism to happen and to expand Rome to unprecedented power, and therefore giving those who had merit the capacity of proving and earning their own imperium. This is extremely important as far as Christianity itself is concerned, because you would think, but if Christ has transfigured the world, why are we still mortal? Because God does not want to strip us of the merit of saving ourselves. After all, Christianity is very straightforward about that. It's not like Christ is some sort of weird medium between you and God. He's God himself, and the Christum Mummus is essentially a pattern of divine imitation, which every man has to pursue, hence also the works, hence all the complete continuity from pre-Christian beliefs, and especially the Catholic one. Now, this same spiritual direction of the empire is mirrored in the Roman symbolism of fire that we explained before with Vesta, in the austere severity of the Patria Potestas, so the absolute paternal authority over family members, granting life and death power over children and slaves under Roman law, notoriously enough, emblematic of hierarchical order throughout all Roman history. In generally, in the entire architecture of a legal system that Giambattista Vico, the Italian philosopher and jurist, 1668-1744, when in his 1725 Scienza Nuova posited history as cyclical stages of divine, heroic, and human ages, with the Roman law as being heroic and of aristocratic dominance. This is very interesting because it shows how part of the Enlightenment actually got things right. Because it's very interesting. Some of you have asked me, of course, to talk about him because he had really that classical culture and that sense spiritual understanding of the past. As you know, the various eras historically of mankind, like gradual passage from fall from the Golden Age to various sort of deterior stages, is very much present in the European eschatology. So that things do repeat themselves, but never quite in the same way, right? They can be affirmed in an absolute metaphysical sense, but they're always, at least if they change from the absolute perennial source, they are essentially the generation of the same, because there is no such thing like divine becoming, right? Divine is only absolute. It's basically just an augmentation of power that allows for that divine power, the Imperium, the Sacrum Imperium, to descend, to augment properly, to hence augere Augustus, the heroes that are worthy of that grace and through which the world can be saved. And this, and outwardly, of course, the Imperium, the system of all what derived from the regulation of its handling, gave shape to the Roman ethic of honor and of Fides, a fidelity felt so profoundly that Titus Livy, the famous Roman historian living between 59 and 17 BC, whose monumental Ab Urbe Condita chronicled Rome from its founding to his era, emphasizing moral exemplar, could declare it the distinguishing mark of the Roman people, right? Whereas the want of Fides and the servile following of mere fortune stamped the barbarian in opposition to the Roman. This is explicitly stated by Livy in 22:6. This is incredibly important as a concept because the Fides entails a belief, our concept of fate being still similar, right? Except our concept of fate is somehow more akin to some hope, right? So we believe that we have fate, especially because of the eschatological promise of Christianity, that there is something that is going to ultimately save us. But this is always the sacred king that has fought, right? Has sacrificed for us. And so there are other ranks of angels, of divinely transfigured, partly divinely transfigured past that own that power. But essentially the Fides is understood in a Roman original sense as essentially a parity and straightforward relation between the divine and he who can achieve that, because otherwise, as we've seen, he would have not gotten any Imperium. So it's not merely a parity, but it is a condition, right, in between the perennial. We've seen it in the video about sacred royalty, the perennial divine nature, and also men that literally do not see what's going on, and is the perennial struggle. This also incarnates the Trinity, and it's actually its deeper meaning, because in that sense, the hero becomes apostle, messenger of God himself. And so what Livy was meaning there is that the Romans know essentially what they can achieve through faith, what power can derive from taking that leap in the darkness, because they actually already see with their spiritual eye what's going to be. Whereas barbarians, that are basically the chthonic, fractal dimension of nature, essentially the giants, the titans, are simply saying, okay, let's see what happens, right? They know that they can obtain power through an achievement, but they are just rolling the dice, right? This is also how or why, I don't know, Tacitus describes the Germans often doing that. It was actually a subtle criticism to the naivete of those peoples that naturally had some superstitious dimension. This was very similar to the Etruscan Aruspici. Also, the Romans looked at this divine science, but it was always considered just like a side aspect of actual divination that had to happen through faith. In other words, the Romans consulted these, for example, the same Aruspicas and so on, but they were meant to properly be able to revert that auspice, meaning that if this was a negative one, the hero could actually twist fate and actually make it his own divine law, right? Which was the original concept of sort of fate itself, right? So it's not merely rolling the dice to see how often you win, but just knowing essentially how the dice will roll, and so not even needing to do so because you knew exactly what step to take. And that's why it becomes a symbol of Romanity. It's a providential quality. I also actually write a piece on this recently, and I don't know if this year it will be finally published, but it was still very much alive in the Middle Ages, right? Probably in the concept of Fides, especially the great Ghibelline theological vision, right? And fortune had obviously a great importance in Romanity. I also made a video about the Fortuna Caesaris. It's not like the Romans do not chase Fortuna. That is always to be actually done, because the second element of the Trinity, so the guy who struggles in this space between gods and men, is the same Caesar with his Fortuna Caesaris. That was a theology that he developed on his own and recognized even by his political opponents. Cicero explicitly saying, this guy has a divine Fortuna. There's an aura of him that really is something that what he claimed to be, as also being descended from kings, famously enough, in a public speech that Caesar gave about his own stock. Caesar came out of the Res Publica to fix it by chasing Fortuna through holy war, right? And so the Romans have to do that, but they have to do that because they're still mortal, and in order to achieve that immortality, as Caesar did, becoming literally a comet in the firmament, they had to make that struggle. So in any case, as long as you were previously mortal, in or at least you didn't achieve a certain level of imperial sort of virtue that could be rewarded with the necessary imperium to fix something so huge like the Respublica that had been essentially violated, to sort of motivate the civil wars between, say, gods, among God's chosen people. You had to chase her, and being at her play, because also in the Clausewitzian Trinity, the second element, the military one, is the one of gamble, right? It's what really characterizes the military. It's not a primordial hatred of the people or the rational sort of Athenian vision of government. It is the struggle. And the Romans were very much into that. Think about Mars, right? And the actually different role that it had from Ares, right? So much so that the Romans did not have, for example, Athena as such. They had Minerva, but in that sense it came relatively later, and or at least with differently documented characteristics from the original Athena. It was present as well, like the idea of, again, the soul of chivalry. At some point, it's difficult to document this because, again, we know too few about those eras, but it's all enclosed within these beliefs. But Mars was properly the element, in fact, in the first, the archaic Capitoline Trinity, that properly was permeated. Mars Ultor, the vendetta seeker, that properly infused this the furor, but furor intended in actually in a virile sense. In fact, virtus was intended as that manhood, intended as divinity achieved in self-sacrifice in holy combat. So it was a very different thing from Ares, that is basically an idiot that is detested by his own parents, that is always beaten by Athena, that is superior. Mars, in that sense, was the militarily initiatory, tribal warrior ethos that procured virtus, right, from God to Quirinus. That was another way to say the co-viri, that in fact is the guys who have it's like the bundle of the Fasces that are together from co to viri, that were the guys who received the same virtus. You understand how compenetrated the Holy Trinity actually is, all right? And Fides was also a goddess in that sense of trust, oaths, and good faith, one of Rome's oldest deities, with a temple dedicated on the Capitol in 484 BC, embodying public and private fidelity in diplomacy and contracts. At least that's how she came to be. The idea of the publica fides, the idea of a military set of rules, a sort of knighthood, right, that had to ensure an agreement between enemies. So act just according to the face-to-face, fair struggle in front of Fortuna as well. And there were various manifestations, we say, that, for example, the Fides Romana, the collective Roman faith upholding treaties and alliances, the Fides Publica, the state-sponsored trust in governments, that was more civil. And again, it's one of the very oldest divinities of the city, and in a sense, debatably aligning a bit with the Athenian concept of the soul of chivalry, right? Because the meaning a bit was the same. The Fides was the highest reason of how war, in the sense, had to be waged, right? And it reflects, again, the typically tribal attempt at regulating warfare that we see, in fact, also in the Middle Ages, with the same soul of chivalry that we'll still have to make a video about after all this time. A further defining trait of archaic Roman consciousness is the habit of encountering the supernatural less as Deus, which is a personal divinity, than as Numen, that is the sheer impersonal, imperious power, thereby disclosing a highly specific spiritual posture. This aspect is fascinating because essentially, and I made a video about the Numen, how to harness that, becoming the lord of the self. The Numen was the most sort of metaphysical manifestation of power, right? The Imperium, the the Fides, etc., were essentially just something that men had to cope with. The Numen was just simply the manifestation of this power that could also, however, manifest in human form, right? And that's how the Numen was actually attributed as a title to rulers that were eventually deified, such as the same Augustus, that was believed to be a Numen, in such a manifestation of same divinity from the higher supernatural, in fact, perennial dimension into the world to bring order, to bring an end to civil wars in the wake of Caesar's sacrifice, and also deification. So the Romans attributed also this midway, like you see, in Roman history, we're relatively late in terms of Indo-European spirituality, right? It's not that the Romans were, as some people think, they were more modern, secular. Actually, were some of the, by the time we got spoiled with the Germans that were documented all along when they were still a prehistoric people, but the Romans themselves emerged in a moment in which, as we've seen, were actually pretty primitive. And they were considered, to an extent, barbarians, in fact, by the more civilized peoples out there, firstly the Greeks. But the idea that essentially this numinous power can manifest as a person in this world already entails a gradual sort of earthly instantiation of this power. It already acknowledges the fall, etc. So actually, compared to, say, the Hellenic manifestation of divinity, is basically already severed, because the Greeks saw mostly gods in just on the Olympus, and there were deified individuals, but it happened at some point in Hellenic history by classical times, just because there were important people in life that had held an office. They made a statue, a heron to them. That is also, again, not a simple divinization, but an idea that they would have achieved the firmament. The Romans were way more arcane and primordial in this. They saw the possibility of a figure earning a place in the firmament in a much more easily sort of transcendentally achieving fashion. So the modern secular element is that, as opposed to be fully God or an absolute form of God, like an Oriental king, for example, they would be individuals within the Roman body politics of heroes, the coviri, the senatores, and so on, right? This was a way also, in fact, to say, okay, watch out, because there may be a monarch around. And that's, in fact, how Augustus is attributed more numinous manifestation than other previous ones. So the Romans almost see this numinous power breaking the sort of the sky, or manifesting in the world, coming straight from heaven. Because if you read Livy, that it's a continuous repetition of especially astronomic phenomena, supernatural events that were all connected to this sort of interestingly decipherable meaning. The Romans had been, as we've seen, influenced by the Etruscans, also with the Aruspicina. So it's a bit of that plebeian superstitious vision, coupled with instead the senatorial awareness of direct responsibility and the fact that they could have ascended heaven had they done the right thing, and they were all collectively responsible for Rome in a sacred body politics. And in Romanity, correlative to this is in fact the near complete absence of pathos, lyrical effusion, or mystical rapture before the divine. There isn't anything of this. This would be typical of later also Christianity, because the world again had sunk further, and Christianity is mostly just like a consequence, not a cause of that. And actually it comes to Catholically attempt to fix where the previous rulers had failed. In Roman culture, you really see this straightforwardness. The Romans are that sort of to the point, all action-based, all very much self-aware. In lieu of emotion stand the exact compelling law of the right that both compels and is compelled, and a clear, unflinching vision. So if you want a contractual relation with the divinity that is, however, driven by essentially the meeting point between the two natures, literally in the Roman establishment, such characteristics find close parallels in the early Vedic period, the foundational phase of Indian Aryan religion between, say, 1500 to 500 BC. But it's not important now to calculate this, but this was marked. We will see it, if anything, we will make more videos about the Vedic migration, marked by ritualistic hymns in the Rig Veda. We often really discuss. I also recently made a video on that, emphasizing cosmic order, the Rita, that I also made a video on, as a matter of fact, and watch that video, the one of as a moth into the flame, what it meant in terms of self-sacrifice, right? In this ritual sacrality that is that peaks, in fact, in the Vedic branch of the Indo-Europeans, but that has incredibly prepotent parallelisms with Rome, right? You have these impersonal forces acting over anthropomorphic gods, right, that are, in this sense, like signaling this higher power manifesting in the lower dimension, or certain vision, in fact, over that sort of more humanized conception of divinity. In archaic China, the Shang and early Zhou dynasties, talking so between the second and the first, between the mid-second and mid-first millennium BC, where folk religion involved ancestor veneration, divination via oracle bones, that are also notoriously some of the earliest sources on ancient Chinese religion, and impersonal cosmic forces like the yin-yang, blending shamanism with imperial cults in Iran, the pro-Zoroastrian Indo-Iranian era, roughly between 2000 and 1000 BC, with the worship of the devas and the hours in fire rituals. I recently made also a video about the Iranian tradition, later reformed by Zoroastrian to dualistic Mazdaism, as well as in the Achaean Olympian cult, the Mycenaean Bronze Age religion between, say, 1600 to 1100 BC, featuring hierarchical deities like Zeus and Poseidon in palace-centered rites, blending linear bee offerings with heroic ancestor worship, all manifestations of a virile and magical orientation. Magic obviously being understood here in its superior regal sense, that at some point we will explain further better. Now, what is fascinating in all of this is the timeline, how essentially by the time the Italic migrations were happening, this same concept were affirming elsewhere. And so we also think that the Chinese, for example, may have been influenced by some original Indo-European conqueror, maybe some errant charioteer. Again, this happened all the time in the Middle East. We don't know why it should have not happened in China. After all, it was the Indo-Europeans moving around like that in an ever more dynamic fashion. Why not? We saw how in the Hellenic mythology, Zeus and Poseidon were in part the compromise between that Apollonian and the, or at least properly Uranian and Telluric power sharing, because of the very strong Pelagian dimension, properly as these are brothers, right, with Poseidon lording the abyss, that is even more important than the earth, right? In Rome, you find a clear, pure Apollonian manifestation of the virile confidence in the achievement of this rule, right? From, for example, the Vedic sources, you get that priesthood was very important. As you know, later the priesthood took over, right? Became the first estate, a bit like in the Middle Ages, at least by conventional precedents. But in Vedic India, priesthood surpassed the warriors. In Rome, and also like in Europe in general, this was not the case, right? These faculties were power shared, and in Rome, well, you find this emphasis on right, and especially this individual, in fact, connection with the divinity from the members of the establishment. This is the point, that the member of the establishment does that not as a mere function, as in the courts of India, as they would have essentially crystallized in a hierarchical sense, but in Rome there was still this Latin sort of Indo-European sense of free warrior sort of nobility, and thus nobiliar. This is a concept that echoes also in Romano-Germanic Europe among, for example, the medieval city-states that were considering themselves to be free and in this sense noble, because they, as long as they were in arms, they had a level of nobility, all right, and thus in practice of divinity, just like the Kingdom Militaris would characterize the Roman legionaries, the later medieval knight. So that sense of again, citizen soldier that is affirmed in Rome lives among the most freer, let's put it in this way, the most liberal intended in sort of civic sense communities also in the Middle Ages. And so in Romanity, the thing that we really see straightforwardly promoted is the political inactability of divine rule. This is incredibly important in the character of Romanity, not some abstract mythological narrative saga kind of ideal. This is like, we actually hold this and we will actually take over the world on the basis of this. This is what the Roman sagas all prepotently reaffirm with a clarity, with a fiery confidence that is not to be seen in any other people. And there is a reason why the Roman Empire became the Roman Empire, and on the basis that we know, the one of the civitas, right? Not, I don't know, an Achaemenid empire that took over just like some oligarchy, essentially. At least originally, that would have been sort of more egalitarian powers, always. That's also the case in Rome, but of the war band originally. But Rome is this, again, full body politics that manages to affirm the homogeneous divinity of itself through the Fasces, through the idea that they were all part of the same bundle, that they were a unique mystic body. And just think how this radically impacted the entire global, not just European, but global history. What Rome did was unparalleled by any other people, any other culture, anyone. Nobody has ever done anything remotely close to what Rome did, all right? It's a completely different picture. Even when you compare it with China, you realize that the capacity of a city to take over the world is completely absent there. That there is more like the conglomeration in those cases of a pre-existing set of seigneuries. In Rome, it's an entire conquest from a very small polity to take over the entire world. Also for those who say, oh, but Rome had soldiers to throw. Again, I don't know what kind of video games you play, but Rome literally took over the world largely with much less soldiers than the others had. And even when there are those cases in which Rome could field other troops next, it's because of an enormous moral, political, and cultural effort, not because even for them it was easy to simply throw bodies at people, because that also never happened in the Roman art of war. It's something that other peoples would have done had they had the resources. The Romans had those resources for a reason. You don't keep resources together if you don't have the Imperium. And that's sort of the ABC, again, of European tradition. But if you don't get that, that's why, you know that the world sucks in the moment. Now, what is in question is the official Roman religion sometimes, because we are told still in universities that we can't quite clearly understand how it was. It's actually a very complicated topic in general, because we understand that the system, as all traditional cultures, worked with an incredibly complex social mechanism that we can barely reconstruct in the Archaic era. Right? People look at this Fides almost contract as, in fact, some mere formalism, right? Modern historiography tried to desacralize, to desecrate, as a matter of fact, this kind of connection. But they don't understand that in the emptiness of pathos, there is the fullness of true religious participation, when, in fact, Fides incarnates the ancient law of pure impersonal action. It's divine action. It's superior to the individual, right? Roman suppression, for example, of magic and astrology, just like Christianity burned heretics during the Middle Ages, was the same identical thing. And this happened also in all other cultures, by the way. It's not like there was freedom of religion, as you've been told. This is one of the other enormous pile of BS that you've been recounted, including the fact that to Romans it didn't matter what you worshipped. It mattered a huge deal, and there was a radically rigid hierarchy of cults in Rome, where Rome, of course, stood at the top and underpinned the entire system as a consequence. That's also why the Christian issue, not recognizing especially the persona of the emperor as divine, but it was the only problem. It was not the whole hierarchy, because everybody knew that God was the top anyway. It was about whether the secular dimension was actually divine, reached the divine top or not. This is another story. But in this sense, the Romans taking out illicit cults at some point to say in Christianity because of what was considered in the sense as a superstition of charlatan varieties, also because of the misunderstanding and incapacity to accept that there was something that had gone wrong, as it was normally prognosticated by prophecies in millennial of Indo-European history at some point. Again, we are in the Iron Age, the age of the wolf. We are closer than ever to self-destruction. So, in essence, the primordial Roman understanding of the sacred and of religion consisted in precisely that sort of quote-unquote magical disposition whereby unseen powers are governed through the absolute determination of right correctly performed, right? If you repeated this divine echo through the right, which is the meaning of this of the right itself, you could reactivate that Imperium. That's why rites exist. Again, I made a video we'll see, and I will always post it down below, but it's the meaning, divine blood and sacred rites. That is very interesting because it literally talks about the divide between patricians and plebeians, and why patricians and plebeians had different rites to perform. The first were heavenly, the others telluric, and the other one is maiores expugnantes religionem totum inexperientia collocabant, the traditional meaning of religion, which is quite important. But I was searching. I think it was these ones, but there is the Numina that I said before. Yeah, the holy race of the without kings, because they were kings themselves, right? The ars regia, so the art of kings, and the harnessing of the Numina as lord of the self. That also talks specifically about how this happened during the performance of the rite. And that's why it was necessary. It wasn't a superstitious determinism. Now we'll do this, or I'll give this offering and something will happen. It's not that contractualism. That's a deteriorated form of how people still lived religion, also starting from the Common Era, because things had collapsed and Christianity came to also fix that, because it was not that either. Reactivating the transfiguring power that did not work anymore as the empire began to decline. And so the entire world, as a consequence, that was guilty of that, the entire world, including outside the empire, people had literally stopped believing that, right? We see it also from the Norse sagas, that there was a complete shift, a complete change. Like, there was an echo of the fact that you could save yourself. But even if you look at Arianism, for example, chosen over Catholicism, at least they're not really equally level terms, but let's say the theology of Arianism was not really imposed by Rome, and it was something that dramatically resembled Protestantism and had a very specific countercultural or subcultural attitude against the universality of the empire, in a sort of that almost plebeian dimension of trying to counter to see if it falls, just to have fun, because if you are less, it's better that everything collapses rather than trying to keep it up, right? So even in later ages, while the Roman went on condemning popular and superstitious magic, think about Lucretius, the Roman himself preserved profound respect for patrician cults and for the theurgists whenever the latter exhibited dignity and ascetic purity, because performing certain practices was understood primarily as an attempt at connecting with God. The characteristic Roman religion always remained one that regarded with distrust every abandonment of the soul and every outburst of devotional ecstasy. remember this because there is much of shamanism into it, and the initiatory rites that we see, in fact, in the sort of fringe cultures, probably at the outskirts of the empire, are also Dionysianly loaded. The Romans thought that was some sort of lesser performance, and that the initiation to rites had to be bloody, it had to be indeed dynamic, physical, it had to bring it to a sacrifice, but it had to be a clean, Apollonian, pure, straightforward exercise of virility, and in that sense of an actual providential capacity, not some, now I will electroshock myself because I'm so low that I have to be reactivated through, I don't know, some unregulated devotional ecstasy through, I don't know, trances or whatever. That's not how the Roman did. This is radically important because you find so-called neo-pagans online that they look, this is shamanism. That's exactly how it happened. Of course, there was a level of shamanism in tribal cultures that succeeded in elevating these into something higher, but at large, be extremely aware of shamanic practices in the way they were performing. Always be clear how that was understood. And again, it's not like they were useless, especially for peoples that literally had to elevate themselves above something else. That would, you see the symbol of the warrior beast, for example, so much, because they were literally the lower elements of the wolf pack, of the war bands. And the higher leaders in the Germanic world had a totally Apollonian vision of the same. They didn't really look at the crow, at the raven, but at the eagle, right? Also in the Germanic world. So this idea that the world was an enormous clientele, an enormous hierarchy, an enormous war band, this was deeply ingrained in Romanity and in all peoples who gravitated around it. That's why this is so radically important. And so this devotional ecstasy in general was, whenever necessary, suppressed by force, whatever strayed from the solemn dignity, the dignitas, appropriate to the intercourse of a Roman citizen with a god, right? There was a deep difference between Eastern mystery cults and the Roman restraint. And so also the later Levantine influences on Rome that were, telling the truth, relatively marginal, but they had, and they influenced also Christianity and more, were having an impact on the Apollonian Catholic sense of piety, right? Emphasizing such ecstatic elements. You know that within Christianity there is a struggle between the mystical and the rational. There has to be at least a balance between the two, because they're not quite. Mystical does not mean ecstatic, right? And rational does not mean sort of secular per se, but there are different ways to that. The Romans also contemplated, in fact, contemplation, not just action. Think about when Scipio went meditating properly to have a contact with the divinity in a supernatural dimension in the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus before his campaign against the Carthaginians, final campaign against the Carthaginians. This was a way to receive that sacrum imperium. And then action had to follow. So also the Christian monastic ideal was perfectly integrated, as you know, in fact, also in late antiquity, in some places of great romanity, like the Lerins monasteries connected with the Bishop of Arles, in fact, with a secular exercise of the ecclesiastical office. Now, no matter how persistently the Etruscan element that we have seen, like infesting Roman northern frontier, like whose kings ruled early Roman, whose aruspicy and divination profoundly shaped Roman ritual, while always sort of being denigrated by the Romans. We have read Cicero, what it says about the telluric divine inspirer of the Aruspicina as a sort of superstition, something to be mocked of. In fact, injecting chthonic fears of infernal realms, a bit like in the Romanesque art, like for the vulgus, like the idea of being scared, like was a way to keep them disciplined to a degree, and even to have them initiated by a degree. The plebeian layers were really penetrated by this, and thus emotionally charged and frightening images of the afterlife. The highest stratum of Rome instead held fast to the heroic vision that the earliest Hellas that was invaded by the Dorians, the same way Alba Longa sanctuary was being reinvigorated by the new Italic wave, will find a parallel with. So very long periods here I'm trying to put everything together, but you understand what I mean. It's not like the Roman senatorial elite was necessarily scaring the plebeians per se. They scared themselves by themselves, right? But it was accepted that these people had in fact to confront their dreadful spiritual, genetic, social condition by realizing that they wouldn't or couldn't have much of another way unless trying properly an elevation of their existence. It's important to consider that the Etruscan civilization lasted for almost 1,000 years, and that it basically melted into the Roman one towards 100 BC, but it existed since roughly around 900. And think about how sort of rooted within this also very advanced civilization that influenced Romanity really was. We've seen that Rome integrated any element and sort of lorded over it, but still Rome was very much aware that Pelagian insight could conceal some awareness of the chthonic mysteries that had to be mastered as well, right? Rome, in the sense, elevates itself above this all, still, again, watching straight ahead, following the Fides, and with an epic that surpassed in that sense even the Hellenic model. Like Achilles literally goes to hell, right? And so even though he embodies the Stoic acceptation of mortality and the heroic arete, the Romans saw themselves beyond. They saw themselves in heaven, not in hell, where Achilles ends up, right? Rome venerated her own deified heroes or demigods, in the sense, the Semones. Minor Italic deities or deified ancestors are really typical. Think about the Irish saints, all stemming from the sacred signs of the tumuli of the older Gaelic heroes. I explained also the cult of afterlife, how I was hinting at it before. There is a somatic element that remains, but the most important is the soul, the second soul, that by winning, if succeeding in doing so, over second death earns a place in the firmament. And so you don't have to confuse the Semones in their primitivity, in this sort of rural Apenninic interland, as some sort of, again, necessarily chthonic pagan thing. It would have been if these peoples were not yet riding the waves of the great heroes, which actually, as we've seen also in the early Italic participation to the Sea People's raid, was not quite the case. And so simply connecting the Semones to gods like Faunus or Silvanus, although, of course, originally stemming as all deities from some kind of originally fallen force, right, represented important spirits of protection. They emanated some benign force. They could also turn negative. We see them mostly connected in terms of Faunus and Silvanus to fertility, but fertility in this sense, it's something that requires a divine element, a heavenly ingravidation, the one of the Deus Pater with the Mother Earth. So at the same time, the Romans were capable, together again with these figures, with this universal array of deities, to maintain the calm impassibility of ordinary mortals towards the world beyond, an impassibility founded on the Fides, on the absolute certainty of the existence of God. This is incredibly important. as a European identity, but also as a universal one, that Roman impassibility was incapable of disrupting a life ruled by duty, fides, heroism, order, and mastery. This was the natural life for a Roman, including, going off fighting wars, conquering other peoples, lording over, their own estates at home, commanding the family, ruling over slaves, and seeing literally the world expanding and taking shape through the Sacrum Imperium conferred by God. By virtue, powerful evidence of this attitude is provided by the enthusiastic later reception of Titus Lucretius Carus, which you mostly hear associated to Epicurianism. That was an Hellenistic sort of worldview, philosophy that is seen as a sort of medicalism or naturalism. And surely in the East there would be philosophers indulging in some aspects of that, but the reason why the Romans embraced that, and why Lucretius, for example, is sort of famously remembered for his incredible work, is not quite simply Epicureans about, curing the diseases of the soul. No, it had actually a very precise, in this sense, all-round physical explanation of the natural causes pursuing precisely the same goal. That is to say, to dispel dread of death and terror of the gods intended as this sort of demonic, intended properly in the etymological meaning of daimoni, in Greek. And so these lower forces that were distractingly, as we've seen, like the Etruscan ones found in the Rus-Speaking, and so looking mostly at the earthly dimension, and so the terrible, literally terrible and dreadful aspect. In this sense, freeing human existence and endowing it with serenity and self-mastery instead. So the rerum naturae is not, by Lucretius, a way of simply describing some naturalistic effervescence for no reason. It's actually a very Roman way to look at that philosophy and saying, look, there is nothing you have to be afraid of, right? If you really follow fate, nothing can come. And this is, again, how don't you feel all the most intimate identity of European tradition, this an imperial mastery of the world. I mean, the God-given faculty of the West to lord over the entire globe. This is the most beautiful, right? Austere, dignified, honorable way to life and death, for that matter, because death is only the beginning. And so even within that Epicurean framework that had become somehow fashionable in Rome, think about Stoicism, how much it well married with what we call Roman Stoicism at that point. But it was previously already shared as an Hellenistic idea that, again, had been expressed in that part of the Mediterranean in ways that the Romans found some consonance with, given that their own sort of moral point of view. And so as they were influenced by the same Hellenism, it came to read the Greeks and so on, the same Roman establishments. So, well, yeah, this is partly what we also believe in. And so also in here, the deities continue to be envisaged according to the ancient Olympian pattern, impassive, aloof beings who serve as the flawless exemplar of the sage themselves. Hence the heavenly perennial dimension, doctrine of the two natures, being and becoming. These deities, even in their sort of hypostatic substantiation of God, are somehow reflecting that perennialism, because they're not God and they're something else, and they're characterized. Yes, they're not fully identical as flawless, but they all represent the part of a perfect war, right? So, in comparison with other peoples, the Greeks and even the Etruscans, the Romans of the early period could appear almost as barbarians. This was the case for the Greeks, as we know, Greeks that, however, learned to understand the Romans, and also inviting them to their Olympian Games, etc., because they truly understood that they were up to it. Yet, in fact, this judgment, the seeming lack of culture, masked, just as it did among certain Germanic peoples during the era of migration, the Völkerwanderung, that we made so many videos about, when tribes like the Goths and Vandals swept across Europe, their raw vitality contrasting to the sort of Roman civilization refinement, an actually more primordial energy, a mode of existence before which every refined urban civilization displays traits that are problematic, if not outright decadent and disintegrative. We talked about this. There's a video made about the sins of the Romans, all the Roman struggle in front of, the steppe apocalypse, and all what sort of the relation between the Romans and the Germans. We really made so many videos about that. Really meant, of course, when the Roman Empire shrank or collapsed by a certain degree, nobody won, right? Not even the new rulers did. Actually, also Rome lived well through them, providing them with irreplaceable Imperium, as a matter of fact. And that's why, again, we talk about a Roman Empire in the West. But we find a bit the same idea of, look, these are sort of barbarians, but the Romans did not call barbarians in a such diminishing term like the Greeks did. They adopted the word because it was like pretty universal in a Hellenistic Mediterranean. But as we very well know through Roman ethnography, from Caesar to Tacitus to also later authors describing the same barbarians, those in relatively positive military terms, for example, at least to a degree of moral terms. If you read Ammianus Marcellinus, we have seen it in the video about the Battle of Strasbourg, the same Vegetus to a degree realized that the Romans actually liked the Germans, that they thought less of them. They realized they had no power, and the Germans themselves will not be able to reactivate the same level of the Roman Empire later, but they all spoke the same spiritual language. The Romans saw in the Germans a more primal force that the Romans had once been, and they counterpose it to their own decadence at Similia. You know what's the story, right? So later the Germans themselves would be honored to become protectors of the Romans, masters of the Romans, as much as the Romans had once been masters of the barbarians, partly the same Germans that surely grew a great deal because of Rome throughout all the contact and actual sort of integration within the Roman sphere of a Germany. That there is no doubt about that. It's not like the Germans were factually sort of living outside of Romanity and not being affected by that. They were constantly controlled by the Romans and also sort of positively developing as competitors, but also as allies at a point. Made really lots of videos about the Romano-Germanic warfare. We'll make more. And correspondingly, the first Hellenic account of Rome is extremely telling. The envoy, we said before, Cuneus, confesses to his master Pyrrhus that, anticipating a meeting with barbarians when he entered the Roman Senate, he found himself instead in the presence of a conclave of kings. Plutarchus, Life of Pyrrhus, 19:5. We also talk about this in the video about Pyrrhus, in fact. And, that Plutarch that lived essentially during the 1st and the beginning of the 2nd century AD, this Hellenic biographer that therefore also within the Roman Empire provides us with an actual evidence of how the Greeks would see these things. And in his parallel lives, he paired Roman and Hellenic figures to explore virtue and leadership, right? So there was this duo, this comparison that would go on in the same time which the Romans were studying the Germans from their own Latin standpoint. Within the Roman Empire, the Greeks studied the Romans their own way. And Cuneus, ambassador of Epirus, this is before the major wars against the Romans, during his Italian campaigns of 280, 275, sort of an Hellenistic ruler. He was a relative of Alexander the Great. So they were the guys who mastered this enormous universal power that the Romans would look up to. Think about what Augustus thought about the undead condition of Alexander the Great, tested early Roman resolve and remained impressed by, just like, I don't know, later Hannibal would do after Cannae, as we said before. The Romans really had something else, morally, spiritually, culturally going on, that all these peoples remained struck by, even in the early year. The identical superhuman majesty is famously evoked in the episode of the Gallic sack of Rome. That is a bit of a, not a mythological event, but almost like, everything before 270 BC, it's not a thing. Like, the Romans, there is archaeological evidence of a sack of Rome. It's likely that the Romans were brutally defeated. I made a video about the Battle of the Allia River by the Brennus, Senones tribes of Cisalpine Gaul. We're around 390. But they mostly paid a tribute to make the Gauls go away. And likely it seems that the Dionysius of Syracuse from Sicily had called partially these Gauls to already try to stem Rome a little bit. In fact, we find some of these Celtic warbanders after the Throws, or the alleged Roman counterattack by Furius Camillus that recovered the Roman gold. And so that divinity, in a sense, was in his service. And there is, again, a lot. For example, there is a Gallic deity that warned the Romans before the arrival of the Gauls themselves, and the Romans did not listen, and so they got defeated, and then Furius ransoms Rome. And Rome, from this moment onward, as I explained in that same video about the Allia, but we will have to talk about the genesis of the Manipular Legion, took off with, in fact, the Camillian reforms that are essentially the same Polybian ones, like the Livian ones, whatever you want to call it, depending on who described that, but really started at that point, started around that point, also throughout the Samnitic Wars. In the Livian Legion, as it was described by Livy at the end of the 4th century BC, is essentially also the Polybian one. It is described, in fact, later by Polybius, and that reached full tactical maturity during the Second Punic War. And so the idea of the legion of the sack of Rome after the Allia debacle, with the Gauls occupying the city's suburbs, if anything, for months, because, as you know, the capital in the hill was not stormed. A trauma Livy framed as moral trial-spurring renewal, witnesses to the episode of the elderly patricians that are elderly in a, again, sort of biological, say, divine sense, right? They are older because they have lived, they have been selected, they have survived, right, through the testing, sitting upon their ivory chairs, by the way, symbol of purity, of divinity, are portrayed as having an appearance, in fact, quote, more than human, and, quote, most like unto gods, literally, praeter ornatum habitumque humano augustiorem, majestate etiam, or etiam, similissimos diis, right, almost equal to so many divinities, not only by reason of attire and bearing that surpass human grandeur, but also by their majesty. This is Livy 541, right? Think about how important this depiction is. There is in the idea that these were true kings, as we said before, from Cuneus as well. Furthermore, from her very inception, Rome exhibited through hidden pathways numerous covert signs of a genuine primordial traditionality. There is much about archaic Rome that is not merely accidentally random in meaning, in position, in name, in myth, right? I really have to make a video. I want to make one about Janus. That really is central to this, maybe the single most important aspect of Romanity, or at least the metaphysical precondition of the universe passing through Romanity. Consider providentially what mission Rome had and she accomplished. Examples include the famous sign of the center, embodied in the black Romulian stone, the conical black meteorite set roughly around 600 BC at the Regia in the Forum, venerated later as Cubulus' aniconic emblem, symbolizing instead originally Rome's cosmic axis mundi, so the center of the world passing through Rome. I also made some videos explaining how or why that is the case, like Delphi's Omphalos, placed at the beginning of the Via Sacra, the paved sacred way, Rome's oldest street. We're talking 7th century BC, linking the Forum to the Capitoline, processional route for triumphs and rites. What is important about that is that it's a road leading south, right? And in this sense, mimicking the descent of the northern conquerors towards the south, that is the to be redeemed area. And we explained also in the video about the Indo-European Urfolk what kind of mythology exists regarding the meeting of north-south, so the Uranian and the tonic element, also Rome as the east of the west. I have also a video in store about the Arapacis that deeply derives sort of all this, its own sort of structure from this kind of background. You have so much of this symbolism. Also numerology. You have the fateful solar number 12, the 12 vultures that are actually eventually to transform into eagles, that ratified Romulus's legendary foundation of Rome over his brother Remus, by the way. So we're talking the 8th century BC, and so we are at ideally at the full foundation of Rome. And that mythic fratricide and city building, as you know, epitomized the Roman origins, right to name the city. The 12 lictores as well, the bodyguards carrying fasces, as we explained, bundles of rods with axes before magistrates, symbolizing the Imperium itself. So just like Romulus proceeded on the wings of Aryan glory with the vultures, symbolizing the direction the world had to take straight from heaven. The 12 number evoked the Etruscan Dodecapolis and Romulus's augury. The 12 rods, as we've seen, of the fasces, whose axe repeats the emblems of the Hyperborean conquerors, the mythic northern warriors in Hellenic lore and beyond, sun-worshipping giants beyond Boreas, whose axe-bearing heroes like Heracles symbolize primordial Indo-European solar kingship, the 12 Ancilia, or sacred shields instituted by Numa Pompilius as Pignora Imperii. All right. Numa Pompilius was the second king of Rome, ideally reigning from 715 to 672. Romulus was 753-716. Numa was the pious lawgiver who established priesthoods and calendar. That is to say, the proper possessions of the empire, what were instantiating the imperial domination itself. All right, these were the Ancilia, the Mars oval shields, dating roughly in this sense to the 7th century BC, fallen from heaven, duplicated to thwart theft in this. And this was extremely important because you couldn't be wrong about them. If you had them, you knew they were, but if you didn't know, and somebody knew how to recognize them, and they understand why this is also like an initiatory rite as part of a brotherhood of warriors, evidently here from the Hoplitic symbol, ensured Rome's sovereignty like Palladiums, the 12 altars of the archaic Janus cult. Well, this is heavy stuff. The two-faced god of beginnings / transition, whose forum temple gates opened in war, close in peace. The altars, again, evoking solar deity and dodecarchy, and so this full cycle of the year. You understand how central the number 12 is to humanity in a truly universal connection, right? If you understand the altar of the 12 gods, this is something that also Athens had, for example. Here, the video is very long, so I'm trying to go speedily, but all the 12 altars are witnessed to also by later sources, because sometimes we learn from antiquary works from late antiquity. Forgive the word play here, but it's like we know this is something we have to collect from all these years and say, why did, I don't know, Romans like 1 millennium later wrote about this still and they remembered? Because if you make 2 plus 2 here, as you understand, the symbolism is kind of self-evident. Finally, what more than Romanity than in the ego, sacred to Jupiter, god of the bright sky, the only bird capable of watching, in fact, God in the eyes, right? At the same time, the standard of the legions, an omen that they shall conquer everything against whom they march, to cite a very famous passage. Also an Aryan symbol of the glory that immortalizes, so that the souls of apotheosized emperors were imagined ascending to solar immortality in the shape of an eagle. Right, during the decursio, the Roman imperial funeral, the Equites threw back by circling, galloping around the burning pyre, threw their own decorations into the fire, and an alive eagle was unleashed to fly, to circle above the pyre, symbolizing the same soul of the transfigured emperor that was flying to heaven, deified together with Jupiter. Right. The eagle is the symbol of the messenger, of the Holy Ghost. It's the winged, the Aryan glory, the soul, the naked, Victoria in this case. In classical tradition, the man upon whom an eagle settled was destined by Zeus for kingship or exalted fate, and the bird's appearance heralded victory. The symbol is also so widespread that the Aztecs likewise famously employed the eagle to mark the site of their future capital. We'll talk more about those in the Conquistadors, for that matter. And you can find this stuff everywhere. Like, for example, the Egyptian ba understood as the enduring portion of the being. There's a providential symbol there, like the eye of Ra, that is the eye of providence, and that in Latin means providia, which is the capacity of foretelling the future, connecting with the Fides, that is to take the step in the darkness, because you can see the light. We described in the video about not the sacred waters. What Na means is the darkness, is this veil you have over your eyes that others may see, but you may not if you are provided by the eye of providence. So molding the world in your own image, literally, because you are God at that point. You have so many beautiful symbolism. For example, the sacrifice of the October horse, exactly corresponding to the Indian Asvamedha, the Vedic horse sacrifice, for imperial sovereignty at the end of the warring season. In Mediterranean, warfare was waged between March and October. Like in Northern Europe, it took more, think about the Field of May, of Charlemagne. It was something just for climatological reasons more important. That was, horsemanship, equestrian symbolism, Romanity was top that. And you see there also the Vedic correspondence being not just linguistic, but substantial and simple. You have many other elements belonging to the same universal sacred tradition. And so for all that, the most authentic myth of Rome was articulated not by esoteric teachings or learned hypotheses, but by epic and by history itself. This is something we've been reading consistently in Livy, in Caesar. History incarnated Numina, right, are the doctrine of incarnation and transfiguration are some of the deepest Roman legacies, also to expressly Romanize Latin Germanic Christianity in the Middle Ages. It belong again as a concept to the same Judeo-Christian tradition by itself. It's Levantine origin, but it was radically informed by the Roman doctrine of transfiguration that we've seen in the same video about Virgil, that the myth is probably made flesh in Romanity. And Romanity in this sense reveals the inactability of divine power, the fact that God is at man's reach, that the enactment of the Imperium is not distant, is not far, is immanent, is here, is in our potential, can spark from a moment to another just out of, the proper virtue that a man should have. This speaking with maximum immediacy, as if a series of colossal symbols had been engraved by sheer power directly in the substance of our own becoming, of historical becoming. So a becoming that is not merely a degeneration, but an inversion of that, the Augustan Golden Age, thereby laying bare in historical hindsight the spiritual struggle that forged Rome's destiny and grandeur. Every phase of Roman development can in truth be interpreted as a victory of the Indo-European heroic spirit, and it was above all in the periods of greatest historical and military tension that this spirit flared most intensely, even in times when, owing especially to extraneous influences and plebeian ferment, Roman existence already bore marks of alteration. Romanity is not just thus a story or some sort of distant past. It's the instantiation of the world foundations. Aeterna domina gentium. This is an attribute that was conferred, bestowed upon Rome by herself, by her own deal. Urbam fecisti quod prius orbis erat, Rutilus Damasianus, observing how the world was truly transfigured through Romanity, right? That was able to make of a single citizen what before had been the world, right? And so the possibility of rising to God's chosen people. You understand also why Christianity so unavoidably Romanity as the precondition for the affirmation of Christianity, and therefore they also came into sort of trying to salvage that great imperial Catholic tradition back in the Roman Empire as far as they could. And some Christian currents, as we've seen in that video about the prophecy of the collapse of the Eastern churches by Hippolytus, were true. That were some parts of the empire that had not sort of been able to withhold Western grandeur, Roman grandeur, that does continue living in the West more than in any other part of the world, even today. And this is a legacy that we must be able to collect. This is a legacy that can give enough power to anyone to revert the unfixed. Right? That's why Romanity is so overwhelmingly actual. That's why you have memes today. You've had, as we seen at the beginning of the video, like all that kind of references I made. I realized now this is the 28th video about Roman religion, and I'm extremely satisfied. It's mixed also with Christianity, but for obvious reasons. And I see this is a recent playlist. It actually started getting really lots of views, and I think that here we are really getting somewhere with it, because this is an incredibly important and sought after topic for obvious reasons. You can't act as if that wasn't the case. And long video, but we really needed to make it, because a topic of this kind cannot be surpassed. And I hope this video, as I was saying at the beginning, to be fundamental to the understanding of religion, of spirituality, of tradition, of the past in general. Roman history, more than anything, conferred Western identity the certainty that great deeds can be accomplished not merely in mythos or epos, but in the present itself. It's always accessible. It's always there. This is among the many facets of this, one of the greatest legacies, inheritance that Romanity left to us. There's something enormous about it, and something that can be always reactivated at any moment. This is what the Roman message really provided us with. It's almost impossible to make these videos and sort of not concluding them just so simply, but at the end of the day, this is what life, according to a Roman, really was. You have to accept what is, as much as you have to pursue your will, considering that it's framed within a Catholic frame, and fate is the key to victory and eternal life. So, perfectly aware of this, untouched by emotion, we must go along our path, along our via sacra. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.